in my experience, working with so many people on healing journeys, on spiritual journeys, is the real spiritual journey, the real religious path, the real quest for wholeness and healing only begins when we recognize there's something deeply wrong.
Yeah.
There's something broken.
Yeah.
And it was the same with, for example, Buddha. When he realized there was deep sickness and death in the world, deep suffering, did he go on that journey.
All right. Hello, everybody. Today I have my good friend Jonah Evans with me. And Jonah and I are going to record a series together. And this series is going to form the foundation of this podcast. So this podcast is called The Human Freedom Project. There are more pieces of the Human Freedom Project that are not just this podcast. I have a Substack, for example, and there are maybe more things to come. We'll see what wants to emerge from this project. And the reason I asked my friend Jonah here to talk to us today and through this series is because Jonah and I have known each other a really long time. I don't know what, Jonah, it's been like 25 years.
Amazing.
And Jonah and I share an interest and enthusiasm for the work of Rudolf Steiner. Mm-hmm. And yet we're coming at it from very different perspectives, I think. And Jonah is a Christian community priest. Mm. We will explain what that means throughout this podcast if we can. And I'm interested in talking to Jonah because of his connection to Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, which is the work of Rudolf Steiner, and specifically this idea of freedom. So Rudolf Steiner wrote a book called Philosophy of Freedom. It was the very first book he wrote. Jonah and I have had previous conversations about the idea of freedom and that book. And one of the reasons I felt adamant to call this podcast The Human Freedom Project is I believe in our time, this is a personal conviction of mine, that the word freedom has been so kind of co-opted, or I don't know if that's the right word, or overused, but it's so overused it's become almost meaningless in a lot of ways, you know? And yet it means something to just about everybody. If you say the word freedom, there's like we seem to feel something with it, and no matter what direction you're coming at it from, there's something there for us with this word freedom. But I'm interested in talking to you, Jonah, about what it means. What is freedom? Can we define it? Is there an objective definition that we could possibly find, or a uniting definition of freedom for humanity? So I'm interested with this podcast to explore what I'm calling the 5 primary constraints of modern life. The first is the body. The second is relationships and social life. The third is money and economics. The fourth is the state or governments, the political realm. And the fifth is environments, both human-created and natural. So that lays a bit of a foundation. Before we dive into that, though, I would love for you to maybe just introduce yourself, describe, your work. So you're a Christian community priest, and we'll probably come back to this. It's just to let people know who you are. So, Jonah, who are you?
Oh, wow. Well, that's beautiful. Introduction, kind of foundation. Who am I? Well, I first want to just say I think you're very brave for inviting such a weird person onto your podcast, like a Christian community priest. And but I find it very exciting and interesting to talk in this way. because perhaps maybe your guests will be able to start to sense that I'm not just your average Christian priest. Yeah, who am I? I grew up in California. That's where, no, we met actually in Oregon.
Yeah, let's talk. Well, I actually want to share that story in a minute for people, but
yeah, I grew up in California. You also grew up in California for some bit. And I went to the Rudolf Steiner School, or the Waldorf School, growing up in Sacramento, California. And had a wonderful childhood. Went to university at California State University in Sacramento and got a degree in psychology. And I was not interested in any way in religion when I was young. In fact, I worked at a bookstore, a Rudolf Steiner College bookstore, putting myself through university. And in the beginning, every single book that said Christ or anything like that on it, I just avoided. And I remember also after I was confirmed, because I also grew up in the Christian community, my mom brought me there against my will. And I remember just before I was confirmed, at 14, I sat on the pavement and told my mom I was not going into the church to be confirmed. And there's nothing she could do to make me. And it was the only time that my mom actually did this to me. She walked up to me and she smacked me right over the head. And I was so shocked. And then she said, "You're going to go now. And then after this, you don't have to go to church ever again." And so I did. And it was an interesting experience because what I remember in my confirmation was the pain of the smack was still reverberating on my head. At that time, I had actually hair. And then in the confirmation sacrament itself, the priest blesses each child and puts their hands right above their head. And I remember the combination of the smack plus the blessing is a very interesting combination of experiences. Yeah, so after that, though, I told my mom I was never going to church again, especially never that weird church.
Yeah, I think we've probably all reaped the rewards of the promises we made ourselves as teenagers. I know I have.
I tell my teenagers, never say never.
Be careful what you say never.
Be careful what you say. And my kids, they also don't like going to church. And so they go, does that mean we're going to become priests, Dad?
That's amazing. Yeah.
So anyway, I got a degree in psychology at the university, and I was very interested in Jungian depth psychology, and I wanted to become a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, and I was fascinated by the soul and its dynamics and the shadow and individuation and becoming your best self and all of these things and archetypes and soul archetypes. And in that milieu, I was also studying Asian, Eastern philosophies. I was practicing Zen Buddhism. I was doing something called Aikido, which is a Japanese martial art.
I remember.
And I was just immersing myself in spirituality of the Eastern sort. And I also did a few vision quests of the Lakota tradition. And around the time when I was 21, I met a couple of teachers who were able to introduce me to anthroposophy, which is this term for this philosophy of Rudolf Steiner that they were able to introduce me to anthroposophy, the philosophy that I had unknowingly grown up in, that's behind the Waldorf schools and behind actually the Christian community in many ways. But of course, being in a Waldorf school or growing up in the Christian community, people don't force that philosophy on you. It's just part of your life, as you know. But now go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, for people listening that don't know, some of them maybe have been in my audience for a long time, some are new. I grew up in a Waldorf school through 6th grade, and then I went to public school. So, so the Waldorf schools, if you've ever heard of them, were founded in a way, I guess you could say, I don't know, or inspired by Rudolf Steiner and his philosophy.
Yeah. And they're very much focused on capacities like reverence for learning, love for freedom, reverence for life, basically. These are the kinds of ideals that they espouse to, as opposed to a particular doctrine or religious path. So where was I?
So you're kind of describing being introduced to anthroposophy, which is behind the Waldorf school, behind the Christian Community Church. Yeah.
I was about 20 and I was seriously practicing Zen Buddhism. And I had the experience in my practice that many of your listeners might know if they've also gone into the depths of Zen or Buddhism itself, where you can have this experience of becoming so kind of conscious, awake in your witness self, I could say that you kind of attain this kind of sense of deep peace and expansiveness, where everything in your consciousness that arises and falls as ideas or pictures or concepts just kind of comes and goes, and you feel centered in a very powerful way in your own consciousness. And it's a kind of blissful experience. It's kind of awakening to the emptiness, or there's very many ways that you can describe it. And as I was experiencing this, certain questions arose in me that these teachers were able to link into, these new teachers that I had found. And the questions that arose in me was, is this all there is? Really? Just my consciousness? Is my awake consciousness that feels this bliss really God? As so many of the more New Age teachers were proclaiming. Is it really the case that if I peel away all of my personas, that at the center in my awake consciousness, I am actually God? This was what the teachers around me were telling me, not these new teachers. So I really wondered, and at the same time, I also, and I didn't really know it then, but I had this impulse, this deep feeling that no, that wasn't all there was. And I could know something greater than myself. I could know beings beyond myself that were spiritual, like angels, for example, or God. But I didn't really have an experience yet. And so these teachers came along and they introduced me to this thing called anthroposophy. And they showed me how to bridge what I found that was really helpful in Zen, like a certain inner freedom in experiencing this kind of bliss and this kind of emptiness and this kind of self-consciousness. And they also said there is a way to bridge that inner sense of self and inner experience of bliss. There's a way to bridge it with something greater than yourself. There's a way to step into something called the spiritual world, where there are beings that are other than you, that are real, not just your imagination. So that I was I was inspired, and I started reading Rudolf Steiner's works, and his path of knowledge, and was very much inspired by his basic guideline that there is something called a spiritual world. It's populated with spiritual beings that have consciousnesses, angels, archangels, archai, all the way up to the seraphim, and God and Christ. And I didn't really care so much about Christ at that point, but I thought it was really interesting to go on this journey to know for myself, to experience for myself. So, and that was a kind of turning point for me in my life, where I started to focus very much on this more kind of Western spiritual path that wasn't just about following rules and getting to heaven, but about finding heaven on earth and going on a path of transformation through which I could know for myself.
Yes. So the primary thing I want to pull out from that, but I also want to actually before we get too deep into the esoteric, I definitely want to just share with people a little more about how we met and our connection and why I asked you here specifically. But you just said something that I think is very important for our time, which is that you wanted to know for yourself.
Yeah.
I have my version of that, but it's completely the opposite. It's so like I was saying, this is why I asked you to do this series with me, because I think if we actually have arrived, we've sort of came to the same conclusion, or we've arrived at the same point, but through very different paths. So again, we're at this meeting point. So what I'm hearing you say is it was really important to you early in life. You had the actual self-awareness to even realize or say to yourself, I want to know for myself these higher worlds, these spiritual realities. Is that that was your pursuit? And mine was the complete opposite. It was I want to know for myself how this place works.
Wow, interesting.
How the body works, how relationships work on a very, it could go so many directions talking about relationships, but why does conflict happen? Why can I say one word and I think you know what I mean, but you don't, and you take it a different way? What is that about? I want to get to the bottom of it. And it was my pain, really, pain. And to be very specific, actually, it was, I wanted to know for myself what pain is. Because I would be willing to bet that everybody listening, those of you out there listening to this, there's something in you that you want to know for yourself. I've never met anyone without that drive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think that's so important. And I would say from now into the future, the only religious path or religious life or spiritual journey that's going to have any significance for human beings is going to be one that is imbued with that impulse, that directive to know for yourself and not just blindly believe.
Yeah.
Nobody feels human anymore to just blindly believe.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. So that's what you were saying.
But that's so interesting, Elisha, because your impulse to really know for yourself and understand pain, that really struck me. I can really see from another point of view, that was also my question. Why is it that the human condition involves suffering? That was one of the main questions of entering Buddhism. How, and the other side of that is, how do we liberate ourselves from suffering? This is the central question of Buddhism. What is suffering? what is pain? What is its nature? Where did it come from? Why is it there? And how do we free ourselves from suffering? Is the central kind of original Buddhist question. The development of Buddhism, though, slightly modified that, where one renounces freedom from pain in order to help all beings in their pain. But that's another story, and it also interestingly connects to my journey. That freedom from pain is no longer now my interest. And I know it's also true for you. Just mere absence of pain is not our interest.
No. So I've, for 12 years, called myself a pain advocate.
Right.
Yeah.
And you don't mean you're a masochist.
No.
Right?
No.
What do you mean?
I mean, there's wisdom in pain. There's something in pain that's for us.
So I find that so interesting, and maybe that's another. You talk about your 5 constraints, which I think are fascinating. But I would add one more, boldly, if you can forgive me for modifying. But it would be the pain that comes to us in our karmic destiny. That our destiny itself, we don't necessarily choose all of the illnesses or the crises or the difficulties or the pains that come from having the parents that we had.
Yeah. Yes. So this is great because, as I mentioned in the beginning to the audience, we've agreed to do a series. So pain is something I definitely want. It'll probably be a theme that we'll weave through these series. Obviously, it came up in your story and my story, and it's everybody. I don't know anybody without pain of some kind.
No.
Yeah. So I guess the reason I said there's something for us in pain is it could be many somethings. It could be the karma. It could be it leads us to some destiny thing. It could be, grappling with it, because this is what I call, these 5 primary constraints, as far as I can tell, are what we might call the physical playground on which we earn freedom on some level, or it's developed through, because the other option is just to opt out. Say, I refuse to grapple with my body. I don't have a body. I pretend it doesn't exist. I'm going to spiritual bypass it. I don't know. Pain? What pain? I know some people who, but yeah, it's very difficult, I think. I don't know anybody personally who isn't grappling with these 5 constraints on some level. So it's broad, it's deep. There's a lot there. If I can rein us back in, though, I'd love to come back to maybe your story. Maybe before we get there, let's just talk about, it was about that time in your story that we met.
That's right.
And the way we met is actually really interesting to me because we both attended a youth camp at the Mount Madonna Center in California. And I saw you there because you performed a song. You played it, you sang and played the guitar at the end. And I think, you were probably 20 and I think I was 18 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I saw you and I have a good memory and but we didn't meet.
No.
And then about 2 weeks later, or a week later, I at the time was living in Ashland, Oregon. And one of the things we did back then, because my God, Jonah, we're so old, but there wasn't the internet like we know it today. There weren't cell phones. So one of the things I loved to do at that age was go to bookstores.
Yeah.
And so weirdly enough, I'm not even, usually I would go to Ashland, but that day I went to Medford, Oregon, to the Barnes and Noble. And I'm walking around the bookstore, probably in the self-help or psychology or spiritual. At that time, actually, I had also an interest in Buddhism. And there you are in the bookstore, looking at books, and I recognized you, and I just started laughing. I don't know if you remember that, but I just could not believe that, like, of all places in the world, after this, that somebody attending this, youth camp in California would be in Medford, Oregon, in the same bookstore as me. So,
and I didn't know why you were laughing.
I know.
I was like, who is this lady?
Yeah, so I don't want to go too much into it, but we dated for 6 months. We ended up dating for 6 months. And I do actually want to share this part of our story with people, because I have a lot of people in my audience that have traumas, that have physical pain like me, that have relationship ruptures, family wounds, things like that. You broke up with me because you said you couldn't feel me. And you told me this. You were kind enough, actually, to tell me that. You didn't just break up with me. You gave me a hard truth. You confronted me with me. With something, and it was true. And I even remember standing in my bedroom in that house in Oregon as you were breaking up with me, and you were crying and I wasn't.
Yeah, right. I remember that.
And I remember even assuring you it was fine. I'm fine. And you were like, that's what I mean. I'm crying and you're not, Elisha. And I couldn't even have called it painful in that moment because I wasn't feeling anything. But your comment really stuck with me, and it allowed me to see a truth about myself that I didn't want to be true. I didn't want it to be true that I couldn't feel, but it was. And I think if you hadn't said that, I might have spent at least a few more years pretending I was fine. Because as long as no one else notices that I'm not feeling, I can pretend I am. And I didn't even have the self-awareness, or, we never really even talked about this until recently. But that was a very pivotal moment in my healing journey, because that became my quest. Why am I not feeling? What's wrong with me? So many people ask that question. What's wrong? What's wrong with me?
Yeah. How can I heal?
Yeah.
How can I become whole?
Yeah. I wasn't there yet. I wasn't even asking that question. My mind was full of things like, I must be broken. Yeah. There must be something wrong with me.
Well, what I mean also in that is, like, in my experience working with so many people on healing journeys, on spiritual journeys, is the real spiritual journey, the real religious path, the real quest for wholeness and healing only begins when we recognize there's something deeply wrong.
Yeah.
There's something broken.
Yeah.
And it was the same with, for example, Buddha. When he realized there was deep sickness and death in the world, deep suffering, did he go on that journey?
Yeah. So it was a painful gift, but it was a gift.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
So that's how we met, and we've kind of
stayed in touch
and, crossed paths. And then there have been lapses of time, and then reconnection, and yeah. So, but there's always been a connection with you that I'm grateful for, and I wouldn't ever known how to just let go of it. So here we are all these years later. So maybe now that we've kind of shared with people, how we met and our, that kind of connection point, you went on a different journey after that, after our relationship. And
yeah, it was right in that time. You're so right. It was, in fact, at that Mount Madonna conference that you saw me at is where I met these two teachers that I was talking about. And then I took up this path, and I had this experience. I was about 23. I had been meditating in the anthroposophical way for some years. And I had this experience that was really deeply life-changing for me. On the anthroposophical path, it is possible to come into contact or come into a direct experience with something Carl Jung calls the shadow. Steiner calls it the double, or the lower guardian of the threshold. And one early morning when I was in my practice, I came into the spirit in a powerful way, and I was confronted by my own self as this shadow being. And it was broken. It was full of impurities. It was full of immorality. And it told me, in the spirit world, you confront beings. It told me that I am you. And it was deeply, it brought me to my knees. And yet it filled me with a kind of sense of mission and purpose. Because it said also, you are responsible to work to transform me. Mm-hmm. So again, this kind of impulse, I would just link it to our shared impulse, where pain is not something to just get away from. This being, it was a painful experience, but it was important, meaningful. There was something for me to deepen myself as a human being. The other knowing that I knew in that moment with this experience was that I'm not yet fully human. I'm not yet fully myself. And there's a journey of transformation that this shadow being of mine is going to help me go on. But I have to be very brave and courageous to look at myself in all my imperfections.
Yeah.
And so after consulting a bit with these new teachers and kind of orientating myself, because it was very disorientating in a way, a few days later, I just felt this impulse to go to church.
Like
Very church. Very church. I said, I'll never go back to. And it wasn't because of I needed to go to church to be a good boy to get to heaven. It wasn't an impulse to go to church because I needed to follow the rules and believe in something that I just have to believe because somebody says I do. It was an existential impulse. It was like, after having that experience of myself as being so broken and sick, almost a kind of monster in imagination. It had horns. It wasn't the devil, but it was my being as a kind of shadow, untransformed, immoral being.
Can we pause on that for just a moment? Because I'm really curious to get your thoughts. And I don't think I've ever asked you about this, like, personally, on like, I don't know if you've noticed, but psychedelics have become extremely popular. People talk about bliss experiences and, and seeing the spiritual world through these psychedelics. And most of the stories we hear are of, like positive healing and seeing beautiful, a lot of beauty. Like for like I doubt they would be as popular if people shared kind of horror stories of like meeting their shadow, like but
True.
I know they happen. I know they happen.
They do.
And so I'm just curious to get, because I believe you know this, but for my audience to know, I've never done drugs. I don't do drugs. I've never done psychedelics. I don't drink. I'm the most boring vanilla person.
You're such a very good.
And there's a reason for this that, it's probably karmic on some level I don't understand, but it goes back to the traumas I experienced and encountering an alcoholic, drug addict, sexual predator when I was 13. So, so I don't partake in any of that. I don't really have any judgments. I have thoughts on it, but I don't have experience, so I can't speak to it from any kind of experience. What are your thoughts on that? Why is it so popular, do you think? And are people actually meeting their real shadow? Are they actually encountering real spiritual beings? Like what? Curious, just to...
Yeah, very good question. I mean, I can say a few things on it. I mean, I think it's so popular because people more and more are feeling the existential need to encounter something, a world, a reality that is greater than just this mere materialistic, empty culture that we all live in. Mm-hmm. And the impulse is becoming so strong that we're looking for any possible doorway to the spiritual world. Mm-hmm. And drugs, psychedelic drugs certainly can be a way that will bridge that, open you up to those realities. And many people more and more are becoming aware of that. It is possible to have experiences. But in my experience of working with people that have taken that path, there's two things. One, they become dependent on the substance to open the door. So my journey, I worked with inner capacities that opened the door. Through which now I'm not dependent on any substance. I'm dependent on my own capacities and, of course, the grace of God. That's one thing. The other thing is, very often I've experienced most people are not prepared through imaginations, pictures, orientations, understandings to encounter what they're going to encounter. They're basically just coming out of a kind of new age spirituality culture that doesn't have the tools to navigate properly the spiritual world with spiritual experiences. Because in ancient times, when people used these psychedelics in initiation rituals with different types of ancient cultures, the candidates for initiation were prepared through many teachings and many mythologies and stories that orientated you with concepts and pictures and imaginations to be prepared to properly meet what you need.
And I would say the human being was different then.
Also, yeah. But now none of those things are there, and I would say because of those, the dependency on a substance and the propensity, the inability to understand what one encounters actually, is that the drug path is very, very dangerous. Just one example, in the spirit world, you can encounter things that seem great, but are just your projections, your soul projections of what you prefer to see. And if you haven't had training and preparation, you won't be able to distinguish between what is your own psyche projecting itself and your preferred reality and what is actually objective, let alone be able to understand when you encounter a demon and it's actually you in your untransformed, immoral reality.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that. I also think that's true in the physical realm, that we're projecting and we think it's another person, but actually it's just the projection of our
Right?
part of our psyche. Yeah.
It's a similar dynamic. Those laws are similar.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but these are the things that I this is why I asked you to talk to me, because the Human Freedom Project Stefan is my co-founder here, he'll be editing this. It has a specific aim. We didn't just arbitrarily call this the Human Freedom Project, and we're aiming at a true understanding of this human journey, so we can orient ourselves in it, so we can find our place in the whole. It's kind of a phrase I'm using: find our place in the whole, the capital W whole, the whole human family, the whole earthly realm, the whole cosmic reality. But in order to do that, we have to even define the whole. We have to know, what is this whole? What is the human being in its totality? Everything we're talking about feels so important. I think I went on this tangent because I see everybody around me also, and just people on the internet looking to find their place in the whole, looking to define reality in some way, and of course we're defining it in all kinds of ways. But if we kind of allow pain to get our attention instead of pushing it away, it's pretty obvious to me that we're a world in pain right now. There's a chronic pain epidemic, opioid addiction epidemics, chronic illness epidemics of mental health. It is. And so if we allow that to get our attention, at least acknowledge, maybe like you were saying, I did, something's broken. Like something's amiss,
Something's broken.
Yeah. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that, because people are searching, and some people end up going that psychedelic route. But the more important thing to me is painting this picture, is standing for. So this is what the Human Freedom Project is all about, is weaving a narrative over time. Like, I'm committed to this podcast, maybe for the rest of my life, we'll see. But for a long time, to lay down a narrative, to come back to that narrative repeatedly, to constantly help myself and anyone who wants to join us, those of you listening, thank you for being here, find our place in the whole, and actually be courageous enough to attempt to define it. So thank you, Jonah, for being here to help us do that.
Yeah. And I mean, can I say something about that?
Yeah, please.
Real quick?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that big picture of your inspiration to create a narrative that is about finding our place in the whole. I think it's so important what you're saying about pain, because so often I find in our more new age spirituality today that's permeating everything, actually, it's so much about, well, how can I get to a place where I'm manifesting my life that there is as little pain as possible?
Yeah.
And that's an understandable orientation, right? Because in a way, pain is terrible. But I would say what's much more helpful, and I think is probably at the root of your picture, is that to truly bless and embrace the whole of life, which at least half is pain,
Yeah.
to truly integrate and find some peace in the whole of life, I'm going to have to find a way to integrate the meaning of pain, for pain to be useful, or to be something that I can bless with my heart, that I can say yes to. And that's difficult. That's one of the fundamental challenges of true Christianity, of true spirituality, which is to find, how is pain going to be useful to my whole self?
Yeah, love it. Okay, so with that, can we go back to this painful encounter?
Yes, good. I love it. Yeah, so that this painful encounter, it was painful, but it was also meaningful in the sense that it said, this is you. This is how the angels see you, actually. You're still beastly in your being. You may think you're so shiny and great, but actually you've got a lot of work to do. The pain, similar to the pain when I said those things to you, it was a chance for self-knowledge, to get real with myself, so that then I could start to transform. So I followed this call then, like I said, to go to the church, which I didn't understand, but I just felt this deep need. And I said it wasn't like a need to go and be good or behave or get to heaven. It was really an existential need of, it's like, there's some water over there and I'm super thirsty. Let me drink.
And that's fascinating, because thirst is an instinct. We're not analyzing it, or,
right?
We just know.
I was like, oh, this is why I want to go to church. I didn't build a whole theological reasoning to do it. No, I just was called because I felt that there was something that could have met something of medicine. And so I went, and in the service in our church is very kind of reverent and peaceful, and there's a lot of incense and there's a lot of prayers. And I went up for communion at the end. Every time we give communion, the body and the blood of Christ, and the peace, the priest comes and touches each person with the peace blessing. And I went up to this for the first time as a conscious, free, quote unquote, adult. And it was when the priest came up to me and touched my face, I had this life-changing experience where through the priest, I felt the presence of a being much greater than myself, but so connected to myself at the same time. I felt this presence of a being that was an other than me, but I felt this being was giving me myself, bestowing myself onto me as a kind of gift.
And when you say yourself, how, is that what version of self? What self?
Well, at that point, I mean, we can go into the details because, of course, I know much more now. But at that point, it was more of an experience of just, I feel more me than I did before. I don't know why.
Okay. Got it.
In the presence of this other, I feel more fulfilled and my true being than I did before. So that was like, just, I mean, if we pause there, radical. Because here I am, this Buddhist practitioner who's trying to find myself here as a consciousness that can be aware, like a point that rays out. And here, the self I'm experiencing as in something other than me, in someone other than me. And I find it in the kind of interaction of this relationship. So myself is now a relationship with something even more real than my own experience of my consciousness.
And so I'm imagining, contrasted with your prior experience of kind of Buddhist meditation that you were describing, which is like, oh, this is really nice. It's peaceful.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, it was
like,
wonderful.
yeah. But that even in just listening to you describe it, I can feel so much more in you. You know?
Well, it's because, right. So the fundamental experience there was, and the other part was that being that I encountered, the shadow one, was also present. So this is really key. I was not condemned or judged or dismissed because I was broken and full of immorality and beastly. In the presence of this one, I was also receiving this. I felt it as medicine, this peace, this grace, this experience of myself being given to myself. I felt it as healing medicine that was going to strengthen me on the journey of transforming this shadow being. So not only was I not condemned or blocked from love because I was broken, but the true experience of my true self being bestowed upon me was medicine, strengthening me for the purpose of the journey of transformation. So in that sense, for me, what became really existential and real was that real pain, useful pain that brings self-knowledge, is important to orientate us toward the mission. But it's not enough.
This feels actually really important. And I think we're actually touching the core maybe of why I wanted to film record this series with you, because something I believe I took for granted for probably the last 15 years of working with people, and I still frequently take it for granted. Like, I have to remind myself of this all the time in my work, is my Waldorf upbringing. I was just, we're recording this in December, just after Christmas. I was just telling my mom how impactful Christmas time was for me. Like, my parents created the most magical it was like it was a season. It wasn't a day. So this story it's like such a part of my being. I don't know how. It's like it's always been with me. I loved Christmas. So this story has been like living in my being all these years. But there's something about imagination and the bigger story that I know that I felt myself a part of this bigger story as a child. And I might have forgotten consciously for a while, but I know it was still in my being. And what I want to tie it back to, if you would, is what I see so many people struggling with that I work with, people in pain, and this is where I take for granted my stories. We're working physically, and a lot of the time we're working at a soul level, or we're looking at beliefs that people have about pain or about their body or about their abilities. But the bigger story is missing. How to orientate ourselves to the bigger story, for the pain to have some kind of deeper meaning or bigger meaning, for it, that it's so often just about the person. And I know for me, and this is one reason why I wanted to create this podcast, is that I believe these kinds of stories need to get out there, and they are getting out there by a lot of other people. But without my orientation to a bigger story, I know I wouldn't have healed. And And so that's the thing that I think we're getting to. It's like, okay, so you said this thing about the pain is important and there's something here for us, and just acknowledging the pain isn't enough.
That's really great, Elisha. Yeah, because I feel in what you're saying there, this bigger story that you were imprinted with.
Yes.
And that literally lives in your being, and sometimes you take it for granted, but it's still there, is this bigger story that was given, it was bestowed upon you through your parents, of course, but nevertheless, it wasn't something that you created or manifested. It was given to you. It was a gift. It was a grace. And that's exactly what I experienced really concretely for the first time. I experienced the grace of God coming through Christ, through the priest, bestowing me on myself, imprinting, giving me myself. And that is such a radically strange experience for especially for a white American male of our time, where everything is so focused on making it for yourself and creating for yourself. Spiritualities that are about manifesting and accomplishing self-development. Even to a certain extent, the kind of Buddhisms that I was immersed in, it was all about attaining and like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that grace and a bigger story could be imprinted on you, given to you, and change you from it. That wasn't so in my mind. So this experience then, in the presence of my pain, being imprinted by a bigger story, a grace, a gift, because this grace also said to me, I'm going to be with you on this journey. I'm going to walk with you. I'm not leaving you. And actually I was always there. And I'm going to help you. I'm not going to condemn you for your sin. I'm going to help you transform your sin into something fruitful that can be useful for others and useful for yourself. So that changed my life. After that, I could say, actually, I wasn't allergic to Christ anymore. I could actually say I'm a Christian, even though that set off many of my friends. Like, what? You're crazy. But it wasn't a belief, a blind belief. It was a knowing belief. It was an actual experiential reality for me. And it was all about becoming human more and more on a path with Christ, as opposed to just following rules to get to somewhere like heaven, which is a distortion anyway, actually, Christianity. Yeah.
And so it was that experience that inspired you to become a priest.
Well, actually not. It's interesting. It inspired me to become a Christian. And then I went to the Mass every Sunday from then on, because it was medicine. I needed it. And I continued my spiritual path, also then now deeply more and more Christian. And the Christian community movement for religious renewal, of which I'm a priest in and a leader in, for your listeners, is also much more orientated to the path. For example, like an Orthodox, a Russian Orthodox, or an Eastern Orthodox, where there's much more of an emphasis on what they would call theosis, or becoming united with God, fully permeated with Christ, so that your whole being is transformed, as opposed to just finding certain belief systems and feeling that you're right. So that really started a kind of journey for me personally, but I didn't get inspired to become a priest right away. It was really about a year or two later, after I met my wife, Katie, and I met her in Florence, Italy. We were backpacking, and we decided to get married in the church that I was going to. And the priest at that time said to me, "Jonah, why don't you go and check out the seminary?" Because I was interested in psychotherapy and all that stuff. And he said, "Well, I feel like you might find a more fuller experience if you go to the seminary." And he was right. I did go to the seminary in Chicago at that time. 4 years later, at about the age of 30, I was ordained as a priest in Germany, where I finished I had to learn German and all these things. And then my first congregation was in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And then I did 5 years in New York. And then I've been here in Toronto for 10 years.
Okay, so this is great because it lays a foundation of why I wanted to talk to you. So this bigger story that we've been kind of hinting at, we're really getting into. We're going to definitely go deeper in future episodes. And there's a lot there for me that I can point to. And I know for you, it's, the reason I asked you is the Christian story. The reading Rudolf Steiner has helped me orient to this in a way that's palatable to me. Like you, I have had like an allergy, like your original. And I'm not quite there yet, Jonah.
No worries. Hey,
no, I know.
That's okay.
Well, no, it's interesting, and I don't mind talking about it publicly because it's just what is for me today, and it's okay for me to even have a record of me today, and then I give myself permission to change. Christ, though, plays a role in my conception of world reality. I'm not there yet in terms of calling myself a Christian. But I see the what I want to get. I'm tongue tied because I actually don't know how to speak to it. It's why I brought you here. I know that, with Steiner's work, world evolution and the evolution of humanity is a story that is inseparable from the Christ story. Would you say that that's true?
I would say that that's true, but that's interesting. It seems to me that that's something of what you were talking about that your parents imprinted on you. That feels true to you on a very deep level. This imprint of this deep story, this deep evolutionary path, that somehow Christ is at the center of that.
Yes,
and yet I find it fascinating that you can say also, and I'm not a Christian yet.
Yeah, I know. Yep. Maybe I'll
turn up. Just noticing the interesting tension there.
Yeah, undoubtedly, there's probably something there about a past life. I don't know. Feeling persecuted for, I don't know. Yeah, it's
hey, being allergic. I mean, it's interesting to just say maybe briefly, I have so many people also in my congregation and my podcast students at the seminary that I teach. This is a real thing. Being allergic to institutional Christianity, I would say, is a very healthy thing.
Yeah.
Because so much of institutional Christianity, filled with all kinds of shadows, has been so much of an anathema, of a problem, of a poison for what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has to be really clearly said. It's no wonder that, including myself, many humans are and were so allergic to being a Christian.
Yeah, if we define it that way by the modern institutions, and yeah. So I'd like to come back to that maybe in a future episode because and we'll have you describe what's different about the Christian Community Church and maybe just talk about religions generally, and I think that would make for a really interesting conversation. What I want to focus on with the rest of our time today is, now that we have your background and how you ended up becoming a priest, is this idea of freedom. So I have two questions for you, and you can decide which you want to answer first, and maybe they'll tie together. But I'm interested to know, like, you didn't necessarily mention the word freedom in your story, but I'm interested to know, if that was there for you, if it, like, what has you personally interested in this idea of freedom? And then the second is, what does this have to do with Christ and Christianity? And maybe, maybe within this, we can bring in Steiner's maxim of freedom. I'd love to do that today. That's a guiding inspiration behind the formation of the Human Freedom Project. But those are questions for you that I have around this word, this word freedom.
Beautiful. And so much of this, it's so interesting. So much of this question about the nature of freedom also has to do with pain, and maybe that will weave in. It does, in a way. If I go back to the story I just told, as a kind of continuity picture. In a way, freedom is a journey. I mean, we can't really say freedom is a one thing. It's actually a process. In a way, you could say everyone is born unfree. I like this kind of relates to your constraints. Look at a kid like my 8-year-old, my little Isla. She is not free. She wants to be free, but she has to follow the rules of daddy and mommy. And she's constantly pressing against them, wanting to push the boundaries. So every single child does this. And of course, more and more now in our time, you kind of have this problem. I would even call it an illness, where parents are thinking that if I put less boundaries on my children, that's going to be better for them in their development, in their freedom, which actually turns out to be just the opposite, because you develop someone who has no discipline and is not able to control themselves and is miserable in their lives. But that's another story.
No, it's actually perfectly relevant, because the reason I got tongue-tied earlier is, like, I'm much more comfortable and competent and confident to talk about the evolution of a human life, the development of a human being. We go through phases, and then we can map that on to the evolution of humanity as a whole. What you're describing right now with Isla, like, I know adults like that, including myself sometimes. Well, like,
of course.
So
right.
So
this is, I would even call it the first step of freedom is the experience of wanting to be free to do whatever I want. So this is the first phase, let's call it. The freedom from, if you want to put a label on it. So, from as early as you can remember, you're constantly hoping for, looking forward to, desiring the time when you can eat as much candy as you want, or you can have as many, whatever, you know what I mean? You're free from the constraints of your parents. That's the reality in which.
And the rules sometimes,
And the rules, or whatever it is. Yeah. You're looking to be, and I'll never forget, one of the two strongest experiences of freedom was getting my first bike and riding wherever I wanted to go. I was like, I was free. Or getting my first car and driving and having the feeling I could go wherever I want and no one's going to stop me. That
Yeah.
That experience is something that every human being is longing for, at least, in our cultures, our Western cultures right now. So that's the first thing, freedom from. But then when you get free, when you become a teenager, and first you think you know everything, and then you enter your early 20s, and you start to realize on a lower level of what I experienced, like my weaknesses and my brokennesses, you start to hit up against your own inabilities. You start to get the consequences of your own weaknesses and your own deficiencies. Yeah. Then you start to experience you're now unfree in a new way. You're not unfree from your parents or from the rules. You can do whatever you want. But now you're unfree because you've got this being in you, which is called you, that is weak and imperfect and not able to achieve what I want to achieve. So the second phase of freedom is kind of, you could call it learning to master yourself, learning to take hold of yourself and master your weaknesses. And the more your weaknesses, your desires, your addictions, your pleasures lead you, the less free you are. And the more you're able to direct your own being and choose to overcome your impulses, the more free you are. So that's what I would call a more true freedom, which you could call freedom 4.
Yeah, I call it freedom 2. So the freedom from, to.
Freedom 2, freedom from, freedom 2. Yeah. But that's a task. It's not just a given. It's something that you've got to take up. Yep. And I think mostly in our culture, we're so enamored with this idea of freedom from that I can just be free to do whatever I want.
Yes.
Not knowing that that's actually a prison.
Yes.
A prison of your own desires and impulses and addictions and fantasies.
Yeah. So if I could just interject, I think this will be helpful for people listening. I started experiencing chronic pain at age 14. It got progressively worse. By the time I entered my 20s, I just felt like I lived in a torture chamber called my body. Like literally, I felt imprisoned in a torture chamber called my body. I hated my body because of that, because I thought my body must hate me. It's just here to torture me. That's its job. And so my job is to win the war against my body. So I wanted freedom from everything that my body was doing to me. That was my initial orientation. And it wasn't until I realized that, and I tried really hard to get out of pain. And the harder I tried to get out of pain, the more pain I felt. So I couldn't have told you then at any point in my 20s, actually, and not until I was well on the other side of it, as I am today, that I created a prison for myself.
Interesting.
Called pain. And it wasn't until I turned towards the pain and got curious about it and actually welcomed it into my experience that it changed. But the important thing that I really want to pause on with you is when it comes to freedom, and I love that you brought it back to pain, because to me they're they're inseparable. They're to some degree. Maybe not. I don't know if you would say completely, but so yeah, we all of us have experiences of pain. We have this impulse to want freedom from it. And I think it's even natural and maybe normal and healthy to actually follow that impulse for a little while. I don't know. We all kind of need to. It's like
very much so. Yeah. And why? Because following that impulse, freedom from, is the necessary condition of ignorance to think that I'm good and I'm fine just by myself. Mm-hmm. In that state of like a teenager being free from everything and thinking I know everything and thinking I can just do whatever, it's only in that state that I start to bump up against my own self, hopefully, and realize it's not just my parents or the rules that are the problem. It's also me. And that's where we start to I have a different prison. You called it a prison that I made myself. And yet, somehow you also, this pain prison for you, I understand, you had a transformation of heart and mind in that prison where you started to say, okay, let me embrace this pain and let me learn from it. That was a moment or a few moments.
Well, let me tell you, I've told this story to my audience before, but I want to tell it again here on the podcast and with you. What actually happened is after, you said what you said to me about not feeling, it took me until age 24 to start feeling again. And what happened is I moved to South Carolina and I entered a relationship that was really destructive. And on some level, I had this awareness. I'm not sure where it came from. Maybe it was given to me. I don't know. But I had this awareness that if I just left that relationship, I would find another one just like it. And I felt a compulsion, almost like an addictive compulsion to do it, to be in the relationship, even though I knew it was bad for me. Like any addiction. And so, this was within like a month or two of it starting. I had this awareness. And so I said, okay, you're allowed to be in this relationship, but only if you can learn why you're so compulsively drawn here. And so I started journaling every day. I think I journaled every day for 2.5 years. But because the relationship was destructive, I could feel. This is so from 18 to 24, I was trying really hard to be normal, to not allow my compulsions to lead me anywhere. But what that actually did is I ended up at a standstill where my world was very small because I was constantly stopping myself from following compulsions because I could feel something icky, not healthy about it, and I didn't want to be unhealthy. But when this relationship happened, I finally let myself indulge and in my compulsion. Yeah. And I need and I know now looking back, the reason I needed that is I needed a similar level of pain to wake me up that had stopped me from feeling in the first place. And at one point in my journaling, I wrote in my journal, and this would have been in like 2004, 2005, somewhere in there. And believe it or not, trauma wasn't that popular. It wasn't, it's like it's everywhere today and people are talking about it. But even in my searches at Barnes & Noble and other bookstores, it wasn't, I was finding Buddhist and personal development books, but there wasn't actually a whole lot on trauma. But somewhere it was like in my field. I'd probably heard the word, but I didn't even really know what it meant. And I wrote in my journal, I am utterly traumatized. And here's the interesting part. I felt my body relax for the first time in like 15 years. And that was enough of a knowing for, remember I said I wanted to know for myself, the nature of this thing. And the fact that my body, because as I was writing these words, I am utterly traumatized, a rising anxiety was coming up saying, no, don't do it, don't admit it. But I did it anyway. And so I was shocked, actually, that I relaxed. So this anxiety was actually trying to stop me from admitting something true. And I know I was just afraid if I admitted it to myself that I would have to excavate a never-ending well of darkness, and that would be the rest of my life. That I'd never, that there was so much there if I took the lid off and looked in that, deep well of pain that I'd stuffed somewhere, that it would never end. And actually, and it was a lot of work, maybe it wouldn't have ended. There was no guarantee. But the fact that my body relaxed, this body that I thought was against me, that was a prison, that I thought was a torture chamber, and actually relaxed when I admitted the truth.
It's interesting. Then how would you, because what arises for me is the prison that you created, as you described. How would you describe that, what you created? It wasn't the pain. The pain was there, but it was how you related to the pain.
Yes, exactly.
That was the prison. It was like, this pain is bad and I've got to figure out how to get away from it. That idea was the prison.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, it was my resistance to it. It was the judgments of it. It was a certain unwillingness to feel pain.
Yeah.
And so, what I know now is I had stopped feeling emotions, but I hadn't stopped feeling completely.
Yeah.
So because my body was now bearing the pain I couldn't feel emotionally. And it was bearing it for me. This is what's so amazing to me about our organism. It's
But I see there also a grace moment, because of course you didn't tell your body to feel relaxed. You didn't control, right? So it was almost like the grace of God through your body gave you an experience of deep peace in the moment that you said, okay, I'm going to admit this. You had to do something, but then it was responded to with grace, a deep gift of peace that came through your body. And what I mean by grace is something you didn't do, that you experienced as a gift.
I definitely didn't do the relaxing.
Right. And then that moment awoke in you a star, an ideal, a journey, a path.
Yep.
Oh, now I'm going to look at pain a very different way now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to practice not resisting, not denying, but radically embracing, so that I can find deeper and deeper levels like this peace that was just given to me.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I don't think I've ever told you that story.
It's beautiful. I love it.
Yeah.
Because I think it also just illustrates from a different angle this journey of freedom. In a way, and I experienced this in many of my counseling work, my spiritual counseling, that most of this time, the human psyche is just battling against the idea that it's broken. Most of our journey is just defense and a battle against the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Mm-hmm. I'm good. I'm justified. It's everything else that's to blame. That and and coming to, like, your unique way of coming to this idea that actually I'm severely traumatized. It's the same actually fundamentally as when I came to the experience of my shadow, I'm fundamentally broken. Or when Buddha comes to the experience, the world is fundamentally flawed with death and illness. The journey of freedom from is also, in that state, it's also self-defense against the realization that I'm broken.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing finally that I'm actually traumatized deeply, that I'm broken, that there's some fundamental issues, and actually embracing that, not as something that then condemns me. Like, you didn't feel condemned after you embraced your real trauma.
No.
You felt liberated.
Yes. Yeah.
To go on a journey, to find the gold in the ore of pain. But then I would imagine, and it's similar to me, then when you start to go that path and have that ideal, you also find that there's also still part of you that doesn't really want that ideal that you have to battle against, even though you know it. Like, there's still part of me that just wants to get away from pain and have my, even though I know pain always is something for me. So then we start the journey of the battle of freedom for an ideal, a picture, a narrative, a story that you're now directed toward. I'm now directed toward. And then for me, like, for example, this is interesting also just in the nature of pain, and I'm sure you probably have something to say to that. What I've discovered through working with this type of relationship, that pain, that discomfort, that weaknesses, that brokennesses are useful to help me know myself. And also, as your story also reveals, help me find new ways of feeling the grace of God, or the grace of the mysterious wisdom of your body, that we can be bestowed upon and gifted health. And there's three things in that light about pain that I've noticed also in helping people on this journey in counseling, is there's three types of pain. There's fix-it pain, there's transformational pain, and there's bearing pain. Fix-it pain is like someone comes to you with a broken arm, and you don't sit there and say, oh, well, how is this helping you transform? You help them, you get a brace, you give them some, medical attention. And then maybe later we can look at a transformational question. And then there's some pain that is calling you for a deep inner process to go through a journey of transformation.
I think I'd love to bookmark this and come back to it maybe in a future podcast, because this might be a point of disagreement between us. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I would say there's one further kind. It's bearing.
Yeah, bearing.
Pain that cannot be changed in this lifetime. Mm-hmm. For example, poverty. Mm-hmm. We need to try to help it, but it's there to be carried and deepen our compassion forces and our humility forces.
I actually think that what you just said, that way, like, deserves a full podcast. Like, how do we know what's fix-it pain, what is transformational pain, and what pain we're supposed to bear, and then how do we orient to that, and what do we do? Because as you mentioned, because even the bearing of certain pains, it doesn't mean, oh, I just have to bear it. And there's, and that could easily be like a shrugging of it off, which is not really
not resignation. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So because, the reason I'm just saying maybe we reserve that for a future podcast is that just, I want to go deep on that, like that wide. So if we could come back to freedom, I think you were leading towards maybe some third, so freedom from, freedom to. And I had asked you originally a while back what freedom means to you personally, or, how that related to your path. And then also, what does it have to do with Christ? Or what does it have to do? What does the idea of freedom have to do with world evolution, with being human? the picture, that whole picture that I'm looking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea too, because this work with pain, it integrates, but we can come back to it. But yeah, freedom from. So I'm just also basing this on actual life. Like, this is actual life. This isn't in a way, it's not a theory. It's just we are born wanting to be free from. And when we get it, then we enter into a journey of learning how to encounter our own weaknesses that hinder us. And like your and my experiences, having a deep experience that awakens us to an ideal through which we find a good reason to serve. And then our journey is free for that, but we constantly have to, it's not just like we decide to serve something and that means we're all freed up to do that.
Okay.
We have to encounter our weaknesses and transform in and through trying to be free for something.
It's that, Jonah. That is why you're here, because this is the thing that I constantly lose sight of or take for granted that feels a part of my being, which is, for example, a lot, like, what I want to admit maybe to my audience is that I know this is a deep knowing in me that part of my current experience of freedom has to do with the fact that I used what I had learned from my own journey through pain to a degree of practical freedom, I might say. Like, I wanted the freedom to trail run again without pain. And I achieved that, you could say, or it was bestowed upon me, maybe. Maybe we could go into that story when we do that deep dive on pain. But then I opened a private practice and I started working with people, and it quickly became apparent to me that I had to put all of my assumptions aside and all of my projections and everything I thought I knew about each person entering my office and figure out what they need. So I had to be of service. Because
right. But and you found that was more useful for your star of helping them find a new relationship with pain.
Yes, but the other important point that I want to make here that feels like something we constantly overlook is that I know for a fact, because I did it earnestly, some grace has been bestowed upon me. Like and the reason it felt important to say this is that so often today are seeking the freedom to, for example, or freedom for, is maybe behind that is a self-seeking. I want freedom for me. And not that that's wrong, actually. It's like, it's the
part of the journey.
Yeah. But this is the reason I wanted you to record this foundational series with me, because it is something I lose sight of often in my work, is the importance of like this aspect of freedom, that it can't only be self-serving.
No.
And like, for example, share just something I've noticed the last few years, and yeah, it was just something I've kind of observed lately. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and leading up to starting this podcast, I've been listening to even more to figure out what kind of podcast host do I want to be, and what kind of conversations do I want to create. And it's an art form, and I know I'm probably going to suck at it in the beginning, but I've noticed that there are people who really care about the truth, what we might say, capital T truth. and they're out there on podcasts, and they write, and they're shouting the truth from the rooftop, so to speak, right? But I don't necessarily feel with a lot of those people, certainly not all of them, that they care about humanity. And then there are people who obviously deeply care about humanity. And they're out there caring about humanity visibly, publicly, they're out there. They're whatever work they're doing is, I can tell there's a gesture behind it, an energy of caring for humanity. And they don't necessarily care about the truth. Yeah. And this is, I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this because we've been talking a little bit about truth today, and this will probably lead us somewhere we'll have to put another bookmark in it and come back to it in a future one. But like, what does truth have to do with freedom? Yeah. And what do these two things have to do with the world, the non-self? It's like, so just to tie it back to what I was saying, like, I want your thoughts on freedom in the context of, like, what does freedom, freedom in my experience can't just be self-serving. But maybe there's an aspect, or it's like that journey you were describing, right? First we were born, wanting freedom from, then we realize we're in our own way. We have inadequacies. And so this leads us to, ideally anyway, leads us to learning freedom 4 or freedom 2 paths, even if we don't call it that. And then somewhere along that journey, you mentioned, being of service. And I stopped you and went on this tangent and the reason it felt important for me to say that, just to tie it back, is that it's something I take for granted. And I want to remind people out there, like, I just think sometimes the healing actually occurs, as Jonah just described, as a bestowing, as grace given to someone who's truly being of service. But it's all too easy in today's world of social media and Instagram and YouTube and whatnot to think that, if I want to be like as free as Jonah, I just have to do what Jonah did, or these, or if I want the freedom to run like Elisha and I have knee pain, I just need to do what Elisha did. And yeah, it's a complex thing I'm asking, I know, but.
Well, I would say, and we'll weave this all together. I mean, ultimately at the top of the mountain, truth, love, and freedom all unite. So if we keep with this path of freedom, I think we'll find those other two. But maybe I could just tell a little story to illustrate. I think the difficulty you're trying to get at, this problem of being, even if I'm free to or free for something, it can still all be about me. There's plenty of people devoted to ideologies that are fanatical, even so-called Christian ones, that are fanatical and have the desire underneath to just make little copies of myself everywhere. Everyone thinks what I think. Everyone does what I do. And the world is just a reflection of me so that I can be comfortable, basically, and feel myself everywhere. That's a classic reality that in the time of conspiracy theory and everyone has everything, it's rampant. And fundamentalist spirituality everywhere. So there's a story. I was just at a Christmas party the other day, and we were talking. A conversation arose in the group gathered there, wonderful people, of this couple that decided to leave Canada and go to Sri Lanka and try. They were able to find a way through their work online and their work with publishing and editing to free themselves up of location and get an income anywhere on the earth. And so they then went to Sri Lanka, and they lived closer to nature, and they were talking about having better work-life balance and all kinds of different tropes that we hear today. They were fulfilling themselves in many ways. But even though they also wanted to free themselves from the rat race and the capitalistic mentality and all these things. And they had found a way, even though that way was in many ways based on deep privileges that they were probably unaware of. But it was also good in a way, and everyone was kind of acknowledging that's great. You found a way to be more free, essentially. And then a kind of maybe humble or more timid father in the group spoke up and just said, in the midst of this kind of self-improvement, leaving the economic rat race milieu, his father said, well, I actually feel oppressed by my job, and I don't like my job, and I feel deeply burdened by my job and oppressed by my boss, and actually sabotaged by my boss. And yet there's no other way that I see that I can work and provide this beautiful Waldorf education for my 2 children. And so I've decided to sacrifice my well-being for the life of my 2 children. And in that moment, the room was changed, and a kind of different narrative was introduced, a different kind of freedom. In a way, you could say the individuals that were talking about having a better work-life balance and freeing themselves from the constraints of capitalism were free for something. There's an ideal there. They're trying to strive for something, and they're encountering their weaknesses that would hinder them from doing that, for sure. But it was still all about them. My fulfillment, my happiness, my joy. And here comes this other picture where this man was surrendered to also an aim, a star, free for something, the education and development of his children. But it wasn't about him, very clearly. It was about these other beings. And he was able to, you could say yes to a kind of sacrifice that allowed the future picture of these others to arise. He was free to give himself for the life of another. And I think that's a kind of story just to illustrate a kind of journey in the free for realm.
Well, yes, and so this is perfect. This is going to be the perfect place to end for today. So we'll wrap it up soon, but I don't know if you're aware of like the meaning crisis. It's kind of a it's going, like it's a thing, right? Like it's but it's something that a lot of the most popular podcasters talk about. It's it's getting written about, talked about a lot, and for good reason. So we're pointing to why, because and even though these stories might seem really cheesy and we've heard them all, right, of someone experiencing a certain degree of freedom that we all long for, economic freedom, the freedom to travel, the money to buy whatever we want to buy. And then we hear stories of people being unfulfilled in that experience. And,
Sure.
and not to say that it's impossible to feel fulfilled in that experience. It's not. These are all paradoxes, and not to judge anyone's path.
Well, I would say though, and it was palpable in this experience, that even though these two who were achieving a better work-life balance were saying they were more fulfilled, it didn't, on the deep level, it felt like they were still very angry.
Interesting. I heard.
That they still had to, there's still something unfulfilling about their fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas the father had so surrendered to his journey with the pain,
mm-hmm.
and so found such a deep, probably also through some grace,
mm-hmm.
deep meaning in that journey of pain, bearing that cross, so to speak, because it was giving life to beings he loved more than himself.
Yep. So love
became the culmination of the freedom for, but love, not just love for yourself, but love for something other than you. And that's interesting. And maybe that can be something to put the cherry on the top of this time, which this is also what Rudolf Steiner says is the maxim of the free individual.
Yes. Would you please speak it?
Okay. So the maxim of the free individual that Rudolf Steiner takes a whole journey to describe and move through in his book, Philosophy of Freedom, is the highest, or you could call it, he calls it the highest expression of freedom, is that you love what you do. You cultivate love for what you do. And I would also add love is also given to what you do, because there's a grace element there always. And you're constantly working to understand the other.
So can I just share the verbatim?
Yeah, the actual definition.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this is a quote from The Philosophy of Freedom, specifically the chapter, The Idea of Freedom. For those of you, if you want to read the book, happy trails. It's a big endeavor to read that book. And the quote is, to live in love towards one's actions and to let live in an understanding of the foreign will. This is the fundamental maxim of free human beings. So I love that we're ending on this, because that it would be quite easy to take that just at face value. Oh, to live in love towards, okay, like I love my action.
Yeah.
But there's actually so much to unpack in that one little sentence. What does it mean to truly love one's actions in conjunction with letting live in an understanding of the foreign will? So
the foreign will should be described as the will, the intentions, the thinking, the reality of the other.
Yeah. And
other human beings.
Yeah. I mean, for the purposes of this podcast, I'm kind of looking at these 5 constraints as foreign wills in a way. So yeah, maybe we can unpack that a little more and maybe start with that in the next one and kind of.
The next one, yes, because that really is the culmination of, I would call it, living in a freedom for. But then there's the third level of freedom, which we'll talk about next time, perhaps. And that's freedom in God. And that is fundamentally, it can only be experienced. It's not something that can be understood outside of experience.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So some of the themes that I have planned, although, the best laid plans We'll see. For this series, is to we've already talked a great deal about pain and freedom, but maybe we'll come back to it with that one deep dive on the 3 kinds of pain.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about good and evil.
Oh, wonderful.
Sickness and healing, as it pertains to our physical and spiritual nature or being. Sin and forgiveness.
Ooh, now you're talking.
And karma and reincarnation.
Whoa, just a few light topics.
So yeah, thank you so much for doing this with me. This was really wonderful.
It's a joy, Elisha.
So
excited for your work and your podcast, Freedom Project. Love it.
Yeah, I sort of feel like this morning, on my walk, it's like I feel like this podcast is getting consecrated this morning.
Well, I guess some
in a way. Blessed by your presence and your thoughts and your own will to do the work to transform yourself and be of service.
Amen.
Yeah. So we'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks for joining us.